Hello, I'm the Game Professor, and welcome to Games as Lit 101's Review Roundup, where I talk about some of the games I've been playing lately, old and new, and what I think of them. Today we've got a recent AAA game, or, as recent as it can be when it takes me a while to play through them, some interesting indie games, and an old classic that I just finally got around to. So, let's get to it. Code Vein, completed main and extra content. Honestly, that menu screen hooked me from the get-go, but obviously I can't give it a passing grade just based on that. I was excited for Code Vein since I first saw gameplay footage, because I love me some atmospheric, difficult action games like Dark Souls, and I also love me some anime. I came into it hoping for some challenging gameplay, an interesting fantasy story, and some cool anime aesthetics, and I'm happy to say I mostly got what I was looking for with this one. What I wasn't expecting was the extremely detailed character editor. Seriously, this thing is amazing. It's honestly practically worth the price of admission on its own. You can make such a wide variety of interesting, cool, or even downright weird characters in this game. It's a real joy to play with. The game itself is pretty much what you expect when a game is marketed as anime Dark Souls. The gameplay and atmosphere feel very much like a Soulsborne game, while the tone and visuals are clearly more inspired by shonen anime. Those two elements are kind of disparate in a lot of ways, but they come together in a way that mostly feels like it honors and benefits from both ideas. I especially appreciate how it does the whole mysterious backstory that's hinted at through items and throwaway lines of dialogue thing that Dark Souls does, but eventually does unfold it into a more detailed story, and the game's sense of character development is far better than I expected it to be as a result. I really liked and understood most of these characters, and I was invested in their motivations and struggles, which helps some of the story's more emotional beats land really well. Louis in particular is honestly one of my favorite video game characters of the last few years. He's kind, trusting, and somewhat naive, but an experience where his kindness got someone hurt made him realize that helping individual people isn't enough, that the entire system in which they live is unjust and perpetrates the suffering he's trying to alleviate, and that's a relatable and relevant character if I've ever seen one. Hell yeah, man, #resist. I also really enjoy the way the game handles character class and abilities. You can switch between classes, which affect your stats, usable weapons, and ideal playstyles, but you can also learn most of each class's unique abilities to use even when playing with another class. It enables and encourages a degree of experimentation, which actually helped me find new playstyles I enjoyed and probably never would have even tried otherwise. I will say the level design is sometimes kind of disappointing, because the maps largely come down to winding linear passageways with occasional forks in the road, and while the AI partner system is mostly an excellent addition, I do think it's a little too easy with them and way too hard without them, so the difficulty could have used a bit more balancing. And while I appreciated a lot of what the story was doing, it's sort of abandoned most of the story threads that offered the most thematically, seeming to save them for a presumed sequel. And frustratingly, while the good ending you have to work for is definitely happier, the bad ending delivers a lot more closure and satisfying, if tragic, conclusion to some of those themes. Combine that with some annoying treatment of female characters, which could be intentional commentary on how women tend to be exploited in unjust systems like the one this game takes place in, but, probably not. And the story isn't quite what I wanted it to be. But it is still, overall, a compelling and enjoyable experience. Code Vein is pretty much exactly what I wanted it to be, and while it falls short in a few places, I'm still real glad I played it. And Games as Lit 101, I'm giving it a B, and a recommendation for anyone who's into anime and Souls-style gameplay. Now, time for some indie games. Anodyne, completed main content. I've been seeing a lot of discussion about the recently released sequel to this game, so when one of my patrons chose Anodyne for a Game Club playthrough, I was glad to give it a shot. And it's... If I were to describe it briefly, I'd say it's built like a tribute to the original Legend of Zelda on the NES, with a story and setting more reminiscent of modern offbeat indie games like Off, One Shot, and Undertale. That is theoretically up my alley, or at least sort of adjacent to my alley, but my experience with Anodyne was unfortunately more confusing than particularly compelling. I'd wander around for ages trying to figure out where to go next, sometimes even finding a path I'd somehow missed, only to see it loops back around to somewhere I'd already been without actually getting me anywhere new. Some of the dungeons can get kind of confusing too, and for some reason, it does that thing where you need to collect X amount of items to get to the end, but instead of requiring less of them than the total so there's more to collect beyond the bare minimum, it actually requires all but one of them. And when my experience with the game is hit and miss, I'm not super excited to hear that I have to do pretty much every everything possible in it if I want to just see the main basic ending. Now that's not to say it's without any value. The story didn't really hit any emotional notes for me, but it does do some interesting things that got me thinking. The atmosphere was the best part of the game for me by far. It felt increasingly alien as I progressed, and the entire game made me feel very uncomfortable, which was extremely intentional. There's also a great sequence in a town where the entire visual aesthetic changes, the way you interact with the world unexpectedly shifts in a rather disturbing and surprising way, and it's times like that the game really just works. I didn't hate every minute I spent with Anodyne, but I definitely wish it felt a bit more polished and carefully designed than it does. So I'm gonna give Anodyne a C in Games as Lit 101, and a recommendation only for people who are already into this particular genre of indie games. We'll see how I feel about the sequel when I get to it. Sagebrush, completed main and extra content. I'm just going to come right out and say that you should play Sagebrush. It's really good. I'm very glad I played it, and I think you will be too. Content warning for some mature themes though, because it is about exploring the site of occult mass suicide, so there's some stuff in here about suicide, torture, psychological and sexual abuse. None of it's shown, but it's alluded to and discussed, so, if you can handle that, I highly recommend it. Sagebrush is a walking simulator about visiting a cult compound after said cult committed mass suicide, and on a gameplay level, it's about what you'd expect it to be. You go around looking at things that inform you of what happened here and what the cult was like. A pantry full of spoiled food, notes with different Bible verses in the men and women's bathrooms, a letter about one of the children's resistance to the cult's teachings in the schoolhouse, stuff like that. As you go, you find out more until you come to the ultimate truth and context of what happened here, which I will not spoil because it's honestly one of the more powerful sequences I've played in a good long while. Seriously, play this game. It's worth it. It has a lo-fi art style that makes it look kind of like it was made in the 90s or so. It's not, and it's clearly not the same technology that games back then used, but that's also intentional. It feels like we're stepping into the past, into something faded with time but no less real than it ever was, which is an extremely appropriate artistic choice for the story being told. Similarly impressive is the sheer amount of insight the game gives into how cults operate, how they take a religious base, Christianity in this case, and twist it to the whims of a charismatic leader who eventually uses his authority to his own personal ends. How the followers come seeking peace after tragedy or abuse or just plain unfulfillment, only to get caught up in something toxic that treats them just as badly. How people learn to look away from some serious red flags, even to avoid thoughts of abandoning it, even as it becomes more and more obvious that this is not a good situation for them to be in. The creators of the game seriously did their research, and the realistic, even disturbingly relatable look at cult mindsets is extremely compelling as a result, not to mention timely and extremely relevant to our day. It's not completely perfect, of course. The art style takes some getting used to, and honestly did hurt my eyes a little bit at first, but your mileage may vary on that one, and I got used to it pretty quickly. And every now and again, over the 2 hours or so of the game, I'd miss an item and need to backtrack or look around a bit, which is never ideal. There was even one particular point where something's buried in a field, and I swear it is not where the game told me it would be. It was a real process for me. But none of these problems ultimately overshadow what the game has to offer, so I'm gonna give Sagebrush an A, and a high recommendation for anyone who's interested in religious themes and well-made narrative exploration games. Aviary Attorney, completed main content. Aviary Attorney is a game about investigating crimes in 1800s Paris and defending those accused of committing them. You spend a while in each of the game's 3 chapters looking around the crime scene and then take some time in the courtroom to cross-examine witnesses, debate the prosecutor, and present your evidence to prove your client innocent. Now just from that description, it's obvious why Ace Attorney is kind of the default comparison, but Aviary Attorney does a lot to set itself apart. It looks different from the get-go by basing itself on, and even actually including, the art of French artist J.J. Grandville. It's a really neat visual choice that sets the tone well and gives the game a clear identity right off the bat. The gameplay resembles Ace Attorney on the surface, but with a few key differences that have a pretty huge impact. Namely, it's possible to miss crucial evidence. Investigation is done on a timetable, and if you don't visit all the right places and find all the right things while you're there, you could end up unable to prove what you need to prove. You'll lose the trial, and the story will continue on. There are actually a few endings depending on how well you did. I was the kind of kid who loved detective stories but always had to look up the endings to Encyclopedia Brown stories before figuring them out myself, so as you might expect, I got the worst ending. But the game is short enough that I could easily go back to try and correct my mistakes, and I appreciate how this change raises the stakes while simultaneously avoiding the problem of wandering around clicking on everything in hopes of moving on that these games so often run headlong into. It's kind of a mixed bag since there's little real guidance on how to find what you need and win the trials, and that can be kind of frustrating, but I don't think it holds the game back all that much. The story is also pretty dark. Not like grimdark, edgy for the sake of edginess, but it does take place during a period of major unrest and revolution in France, and there are a lot of moral gray areas in cases you're undertaking. The very first case demonstrates this in a way I really genuinely did not expect, and it keeps it up throughout the whole thing. It's enough to separate the game from the few similar titles on the market, but it also doesn't lose a sense of humor. There are a lot of lines I laughed out loud about, and the characters are pretty much all really fun to interact with. So despite some frustrations, Aviary Attorney is a fun time, and I'm going to give it a B. I'd recommend it for anyone itching for another courtroom game, since the genre is kind of wanting for entries and this puts a unique spin on it. And now, an old classic I finally got around to playing. God of War 2, completed main content. I have a confession to make here. I didn't really love the first God of War. It was well made, it was fun to play, and there are elements of the story that I appreciate. I respect it from a sort of relatively objective perspective, removed from my own personal opinion of it, but it really just didn't do it for me. And I'll be honest, I know it's just one part of the whole, but most of the reason is Kratos. He's just awful. I know there's demand out there for games where you play as the villain, and I can appreciate that, even if it's not really my thing, but I'm not really into games where you play as a horrifically terrible person, and the game treats you like a hero. And to its credit, the first one at least makes Kratos pitiable. Like, I understand his motivations and the story can be read as a tragedy, and in that light, it works. And at least that way, we still acknowledge that he's just the absolute worst. The second one doesn't do that. The second one doesn't really do much of anything, honestly. It just kind of sits there wallowing in blood and anger and arbitrary violence and going nowhere. I actually tried playing it years ago and gave up pretty quick, but I really want to play Dad of War, and I rarely regret playing preceding games before new ones, so I decided to suffer through this one as preparation, and yeah, I didn't like it. And not just because of the incredibly awkward sex minigames shoehorned into the first 10 minutes, but like, come on, God of War 2. Come on. As with the first one, it is very polished. The gameplay is smooth and functional, and I had fun with it. But it also shows its age, not through the visuals and technology, which are actually still rather impressive, but more through the weird design decisions. The game isn't a platformer, not in the slightest, but it still felt the need to put some of those elements into it, and they don't usually work very well. I know variety of gameplay scenarios is important, and that kind of thing was very common in this era, but making me spend a while hanging from the ceiling and spamming the same attack every now and again so I could slowly move forward a few feet and then just do it again, it's just not very fun. And again, Kratos is just the worst, the absolute worst. The entire setup for this one is that he's gotten so out of control, spreading war and death throughout the world, that Zeus tricks him into giving up his godhood, and the whole game is about Kratos trying to get revenge on Zeus for this. I mean, Kratos obviously deserves that. Maybe this could work if the game was very clear about Kratos being a villain, but no, it has to go into why Zeus is a power-hungry tyrant, and it's good that Kratos is taking him down, and just stop trying to justify this character's actions, please. He is an awful person, and I don't need the game telling me why my cause is actually real noble while I arbitrarily throw an innocent man under a grinding gear because that's just how Kratos solves puzzles. I hate playing as this guy, and I hate the game treating him as anything less than a truly abominable dumpster fire of a person. But to top it off, the story goes just absolutely nowhere. As soon as the intro is done and Kratos is mortal again, we're told to get to the Fates so they can get us to Zeus for revenge, and the entire game is just about that. Just Kratos doing a bunch of random stuff and killing a bunch of random characters from Greek mythology until, right at the very end, he does the thing he was trying to do. The game drops a plot twist on us from right out of nowhere, and it ends with Kratos getting ready to get his revenge on Zeus. Just absolutely nothing important happened in this game, except for the first and final 10 minutes. Also, I said I finished this one, but like, not technically, because the QuickTime event at the end of the final boss is complete nonsense, and it got to the point where I just wasn't going to waste any more time on it, so I watched the last cutscene instead. I hate doing that, but it wasn't worth it. Obviously, it's not a new or original take to say that PS2-era action game QTEs haven't aged well, so I won't waste time on it, but Honestly, I don't hate them as much as a lot of people do, but yeah, they haven't aged very well. I was really hoping that revisiting this one would change my mind about it, but no, it didn't. I don't like this character, the game isn't good enough to make me tolerate him, and the story was an immobile slog that led nowhere worth going. It's getting a D and a recommendation only for people who are curious about PS2 classics, and you know what, even then, maybe just play the first one and call it a day. Here's hoping the third is more tolerable and the fourth is worth all of this background. Guess you'll find out on the next Roundup. Hey everyone, hope you enjoyed my thoughts on all the random stuff I've been playing lately. You know the drill if you like the video and want to see more from the channel, and check the description to follow me on social media. Keep an eye out for upcoming videos as well. I'm also working on getting some more regular uploads going again, but I'm also working on a really big analysis project that was going to be out in March, but now is going to be closer to April. I'll let you see if you can figure that one out. Until next time.